During the presentation, please post all of your questions in the question and answer box. The chat is for comments between you as attendees. At the end of the formal presentation, I'm going to go ahead and ask the questions of our presenters. In case we run out of time, we will write answers to the questions that we didn't get to and share a link to those when we send the recording to you next week. This presentation is also being live captioned, and I will post instructions on how to get to the live captioning in the chat in just a moment. To begin today's webinar, I'd like to introduce our presenters, the co-directors of the CLOE Surveys and Reports, Ron Ligon, Executive Director Emeritus of Quality Matters, and Richard Garrett, Chief Research Officer of Veggie Ventures. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ron to begin.
Hi, this is Ron. Happy to be here with you and to share our latest findings in the series of CLOE reports. This session we will divide, and Richard Garrett, who I'm about to introduce, will handle the first part of the session, and then I'll handle the second, and we look forward to jointly answering your questions at the end of the formal presentation. Before turning it over to Richard, though, I do want to acknowledge our sponsors, without whom all of this work would be far more difficult. So to iDesign, our platinum sponsor, and our other sponsors, Extension Engine and Instructional Connections, a big thank you. And now let me introduce Richard.
Thanks, Ron. Hi, everyone. Very pleased to be here. Thanks for joining us today. Let me give you an overview of what we're going to cover in this webinar. CLOE spans a wide range of topics. There's no way we can reference everything that's in the CLOE report or the CLOE survey on today's webinar. So we've called out some highlights from the report that we think you will find interesting. We'll start with some observations about the CLOE project generally and the CLOE sample as it's evolved over the last few years. I will then dive into some findings about online course design approaches and related pedagogical considerations. And then Ron will take us through our emerging online learning models, where we try to find patterns in the CLOE data and approaches to online that seem to span a number of schools, and we try to make sense of those. And then we'll conclude with some topics that we have made a part of the draft CLOE 4 survey, the survey that we're currently working on, the survey that will be going into the field in the next few weeks, just to give you a sense of some new areas we're going to focus on based on feedback from prior webinar attendees, chief online officers, and so on. So let me start with some observations about the CLOE sample. Just as a reminder, CLOE stands for the changing landscape of online education. And the genesis of CLOE was a feeling between both us at Veggie Ventures and at Quality Matters that there was a need for sustained attention to how institutions were strategizing around online learning and the policies and practices that were being put in place to enable that strategy to come to life. We know the federal government now, since 2012, requires institutions to report the number of distance or online students. So we have a lot of data about programs and institutions and enrollments, but there's no source aside from CLOE if you want to understand institutional policies, practices, and strategies around online. So that's the origin. We've been running CLOE now for 3 years and about to embark on our 4th year. In the first year, we gathered around 104 responses. And again, as a reminder, the CLOE survey targets what we call the chief online officer at US colleges and universities, 2-year, 4-year, public, private, and for-profit. The idea of a chief online officer, even if that title isn't necessarily used widely, but someone at an institution who has central oversight, in some sense central authority for the shape, feel, direction of online education, whether it's courses, whether it's programs, whether it's degree, non-degree, for credit, non-credit, blended, fully online, someone who is increasingly conscious of the significance and scale of online learning, and therefore the need for someone to have that oversight role. Those folks go by many different names, from VPs to directors to deans, but all of them in some sense are the chief online officer at their institution. So Chloe is surveying people who identify as that individual, as the chief online officer. So first Chloe survey, we had a nice mix of responses, 2-year and 4-year, but no for-profit responses. Chloe 2, we grew the sample very nicely up to over 180 institutions. And again, a nice mix between 2- and 4-year, public and private, and we got some for-profit respondents. And then Chloe 3, the survey we're going to be telling you about today, we had another nice increase in responses, 280, and again, a nice mix of institutions, and the for-profit contribution grew once again. So we're conscious that Chloe is a long-term undertaking. We plan to do these surveys every year for the foreseeable future. We know that the bigger the sample gets, the more representative and accurate the sample gets. So we encourage you, if you've completed Chloe before, thank you. If you haven't completed Chloe before, we very much encourage you or whoever is the appropriate person at your institution to complete it. And we'll be doing extensive outreach to prior respondents and a wide range of other institutions to encourage you to contribute and keep growing the size and value of our work. So with that context out of the way, let me dive into the first of our main themes, a slice of Chloe. This theme is all about how institutions go about building online courses and then the implications for the nature of the online student experience. What you see here is responses to a question about how institutions design online courses, and it spans from one extreme, a very decentralized model where faculty work independently. There may be no central or otherwise instructional design resource, or if there is one, there's no requirement for faculty to work with them. And you can see that we've divided the responses into the overall average on the right-hand side and then 3 subgroups: large, mid-sized, and small. By large, we mean institutions that report more than 7,500 fully or partly online students. Mid-sized is 1,000 up to 7,500, and then small is less than 1,000. So you can see for the faculty work independently when building online courses, that constitutes a small but not insignificant proportion of mid-sized and the small institutions, and overall it's about 10%. Whereas for the large, you don't see that option represented at all. So there's a general association between scale of online learning and greater centralization and attention to detail as to how online courses are built or should be built or must be built. The second option is faculty work as the prime mover when it comes to building online courses, but there's optional instructional design support available across the institution. And you can see that generally speaking, that is the most common response, certainly for mid-sized institutions. It's the second most common for small, or joint most common in fact for small, and it's also the most common for large institutions, and overall it's the most common at 38%. But still a pretty decentralized model. Faculty essentially are in charge, and it's up to them whether they draw on the expertise of any others. Next option is faculty are required to work with an instructional designer. You see that's also quite common, 24% on average, and most common among the smaller institutions, and a little less common among mid-size. And here you see the tension between modest online scale that often can reflect one unit within an institution leading the way, doing most of everything online, and structuring it in a very defined way, but in a very self-contained way. Whereas mid-sized, you often have this tension between, yes, there's a certain amount of scale that might lend itself to more centralization and cohesion, but there's also lots of faculty, lots of departments doing online in legacy ways for their own reasons, and that can be hard to corral around a certain way of doing things. The next option is what we call the team approach, where online courses are built not by individuals, but by a team of complementary experts, subject matter experts from the faculty, instructional designers, media specialists, and so on. And that team approach is seen as the smartest way to build the best, most consistent courses. But you can see much less common, but most common among the largest institution, which again, that association between scale and deliberateness about how best to build courses. Very few schools go for the contract with third parties option as their dominant means of developing online courses, but again, it's slightly more prevalent among the largest institutions. And then the last category, which isn't really a category at all, is wide variation. Pockets of activity, different ways of doing things, no institutional strategy or policy around a particular way of doing it. And again, you see that most common, in fact, at the largest institutions. There are some institutions that are large generally and have become large online, not through any particular central strategy, but more allowing 1,000 flowers to bloom and people doing things creatively over the years, and they end up with a lot of scale in terms of programs and students, but not a lot of coherence in terms of how those online courses are built. Whereas, say, the small institutions, that's actually the lowest ratio at 10%, which again reflects sometimes an institution perhaps late to online, creating a special unit, almost an incubator outside of mainstream academic course development, and that can often lend itself to a bit more structure rather than less structure. So bear these categories in mind as we go through, because we'll come back to them as we create associations with other findings. So let's have the next slide. This slide tries to dig into what's going on in online courses. We use this word online as if it always means the same thing, or we even know what it means beyond just the basics of the delivery mode. So what we tried to do in CHLOE 3 was to get a sense, if only a surface sense, of the types of student interaction going on within online courses. And here we're asking the views of the Chief Online Officer to characterize what they would regard as the typical distribution of interaction types across online courses at their school. And we distinguish between student interaction with materials, course materials of one kind or another, student interaction with other students, student interaction with faculty, and then student interaction with other staff. And you can see the CHLOE sample line here, about 52% of student time within online courses, according to Chief Online Officers on average, is devoted to materials, about a fifth to interaction with peers, again about the same ratio, interaction with faculty, and then just a few percentage points interaction with other staff. And you can see, perhaps surprisingly, that however we divided the sample between 2 and 4 year, between larger institutions that here we're calling enterprise level, the ratio was almost the same. And that may suggest, as you'll see in a moment, a range behind these averages, but it may also suggest a certain basic commonality in terms of how online courses are built, a heavy skew towards asynchronous courses that tend to be structured around threaded discussions that might be classified as interaction with materials rather than interaction with students or interactions with staff. But the question looking at this data is this the best way to structure an online course? Does this reflect just a sort of legacy assumptions about what's best? Does it reflect the standard structures of typical LMS products that most institutions use? How should we go about judging this kind of material? So let's look at the next slide to get a sense of the range. So this slide looks at those same 4 interaction types, but the horizontal axis is showing the responses for each institution, so all 280 institutions in the sample. And it's structured from highest to lowest for materials. So on the left-hand side of the chart, the green line, there was 1 or 2 institutions that said the entire online course experience at our institution is defined by students interacting with materials, which to us means an entirely asynchronous, self-paced experience. But you can see that that ratio, as you move from left to right on the chart, goes down as low as 20%. And the ratio of the other types of interaction with faculty, interaction with other students, interaction with other staff, can vary quite widely as well. So you've got some institutions where you can see, for example, that orange line, you've got one institution above 80%, saying that 80% of the student experience in our online courses is peer learning of some kind. You've got another as high as about 70% for the dark blue line, interaction with faculty. That might be a more synchronous, live class broadcast type model. And then you've got a few examples where other staff, that ratio is about 30%. And that can reflect, again, a more self-paced, in this case, we know this is a competency-based institution that privileges interaction between students and various kinds of coaches and mentors. So yes, the averages we saw on the previous slide suggest some uniformity in favor of asynchronous student interaction with materials, but this slide shows you the variety, the possibilities, and I think online could do with a bit more differentiation between institutions, between approaches, between pedagogies, rather than everyone just assume online is the same just because the basic delivery mode is the same. I think it would help institutions differentiate in a crowded market, and it would help students pick the right kind of online student experience for them. So let's go to the next slide. Related to the course design question is the instructional designers as a resource. So as the title says, how many instructional designers are enough? We asked in CLOE 3 for institutions to tell us how many full-time and how many part-time instructional designers they had. And if you look on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the overall results. So the median number of instructional designers for all 280 CLOE respondents, so remembering this is 2- and 4-year public and private, was only 3.5. Now, we tried to put that number in context by showing that ID median against the median number of online and blended programs at institutions that they also told us. So if we show the number of instructional designers as a ratio of the number of online and blended programs, you get one instructional designer per 8.4 programs. If you look at the rest of the chart, you can see some differences. So the largest institutions in terms of online enrollment reported many more on average instructional designers, 8.5, and that meant that despite having more programs, they actually had a lighter load for their instructional designers on average, only 5.5 online or blended programs per instructional designer. So much more balanced workload, you might think, compared to the sample average. Mid-sized, only 3.5 median number and an 8.9 programs per instructional designer at those institutions. And then the smaller institutions, only 2.5 median instructional designers, but a more manageable 6.6 per program. I don't think it's clear how many programs an instructional designer should manage. There's so many variables in terms of the nature of those programs, the roles of the instructional designer, ongoing maintenance, all kinds of things that we can't glean from this data. But I think it's helpful to show how scarce the instructional design resource is at many institutions, either because they let faculty do their own thing, and that can result in wonderful creativity, but also a lot of duplication of effort and uneven quality. And it's interesting to see the large institutions invest in perhaps a more strategic, sustainable way in instructional designers as a resource, and seeing that as key to scalability and ultimately to quality. So let's go to the next slide. This slide, we tried to knit everything together, and we looked for an association between the way institutions typically build online courses and the mix of interaction types within a typical online course. And we did find an association. So if we go from left to right on this slide, the first pie chart shows the typical distribution in terms of the 4 interaction types at institutions that say online courses are typically built by faculty working on their own. And what you can see is that that approach to online course design shows the highest ratio of materials interaction and lower than average ratios of student to faculty interaction and peer interaction. And in a way, that's counterintuitive. If we assume that faculty's rationale for going in alone is because they feel that they have the expertise, they know the students, they know how to build an effective course, generally speaking, and many faculty worry that one implication of greater online learning is somehow a diminution of their role as faculty. They'll somehow be sidelined and students will spend lots of time interacting with each other or interacting with materials. When in fact, we actually find, at least from the perspective of chief online officers, that the opposite is the case. The more the online course design approach becomes centralized and team-based and consistent, the greater the faculty role and the lesser the role of students just interacting with materials on their own. And again, we're not saying any particular configuration is necessarily the best one. There's lots of other variables that will dictate whether a particular course is effective or not least who's teaching it, how it's being taught, is it being implemented according to the plan. But I think other things being equal, a more rounded online student experience, a better balance between different types of interaction is likely to result in a more engaged experience and a more impactful experience, rather than something that feels very skewed or may leverage one type of interaction over another. So in Chloe 4, we're going to continue to delve into these issues and try and illuminate what's going on here in greater detail. Next slide. This slide gives you a sense of a related dimension. We asked institutions to tell us about what's going on their online courses in terms of pedagogical techniques and tools and technologies. And what you can see here is a number of those techniques and tools ranked from left to right in terms of the highest ratio where that technique or tool is seen as either required, every online course must use it, or at least very common. Then the other options are the tool or technique is certainly optional, but it's pretty common. And then the third option is it's rarely used or it's not used at all. And you can see the most commonly used are a mix of familiar techniques that belong in any course, online or otherwise, things like preparatory reading, short written assignments, short quizzes. Threaded discussions is certainly most common, which is consistent with that asynchronous bias in online courses that Chloe has shown year after year, and I think also supports the heavy ratio of time students spend interacting with materials. As you go from left to right, you can see things like pre-recorded video, whether third party or in-house, group projects, student presentations, much less likely to be very common or required, but pretty visible when it comes to optional but common. And then on the right-hand side, you see things that get a lot of attention in the media, but are struggling to scale up. Things like digital simulations, role play, gamification of one kind or another, very unlikely to be required or very common. To some extent, becoming common, which is encouraging, but for most institutions, it's still rare or not used. So again, I think we're trying to knit together here how courses are designed, the basic look and feel of a course in terms of the student experience, and then the nature of pedagogical activities, supporting tools and technologies. We're groping towards trying to find deeper patterns here that might start to suggest for a certain field of study, for a certain student type at a certain institution, is a certain combination of those elements going to result in better outcomes. We're not there yet, but we're striving in that direction. So let me pause there and hand it over to Ron.
Thank you, Richard. And I'll now transition us to talking about online learning models. From its very outset, the Chloe project has been trying to find patterns of behavior, patterns of activity, common strategies, and the like, linking institutions. And as we've accumulated data over the past 3 years, it has gradually emerged that there appear to be considerable clusters of institutions that have some common basic characteristics, and associated with those a number of common practices and outcomes. And we consider this a work in progress, as indeed the whole Chloe approach is. And we expect to be able to refine these models as we go forward and collect more data. And you should be aware that Chloe is not a fixed survey where we ask the same questions every year. It's an evolving survey where we move on from questions where we feel we have a good handle on them and move into new areas or follow-up areas to try to deepen our understanding. Well, the creation of these models and the evolution of the models and refinement of them will occur in the years to come, and particularly if the sample we work with continues to grow, because we strongly feel that one needs a substantial number of institutions in any particular category to have confidence in the generalizations we might like to make. Models can be very helpful in addition to simply being an organizing principle for our reports and a way for us to think about the various policies and strategies and particular practices of the institutions. We feel that in aggregate they can reveal alternative approaches to online learning, and consequent to that, delineate different pathways and futures that institutions ought to be aware of and take under consideration if they feel these alternatives apply to them. A first stage in that is really enabling institutions to benchmark their practices and policies against the groups that we define, and to locate their own position within the online learning universe. But ultimately, this approach ought to help institutions to do strategic planning, to consider alternatives or how they might move from one model to another, from a model that they're not particularly satisfied with to perhaps one that represents the institution's aspirations for online study. At this point, we've defined 5 such clusters, 5 institutional types or models. The community colleges are a fairly clear, obvious group. These are the 2-year public institutions. And we've clustered those that have between 1,000, less than 7,500 fully and partly online students. The reason for that limitation is that those with more than 7,500 students are grouped in our enterprise model. So we actually have 73 community colleges that meet this definition. And we feel that is quite a sizable group for us to analyze. Another large group are the low enrollment 4-year institutions. These are institutions with fewer than 1,000 fully and partly online students. They're public and there are private ones. And as you'll see when we get into some of the data, there are some very distinctive outcomes for institutions of this type. Then moving to somewhat larger institutions, we've clustered the public institutions, 4-year public institutions, we call regional publics. And these are institutions that have between 1,000 and 7,500 fully and partly online students. Some public institutions fall in the low enrollment area, and some, as we'll see, also fall in the high enrollment area. But we do have, I believe, 36 institutions in this category. We might have more if we included the flagship public institutions with fewer than 7,500 fully and partly online students. But this is a group we're still looking at closely, and we're not yet ready to define them as a coherent model or type. Part of the reason is that these institutions tend to be operating under statewide mandates that may condition their activity in ways that perhaps market forces alone would not do. But at this point, we only have 13 non-flagship, flagship institutions, and we don't feel that that is a sufficient number to begin to generalize for the group. Regional four-year private institutions is a sizable group for us as well. And these are institutions that are nonprofit private institutions. While we do have, as Richard's first slide showed, a small number of for-profits, we feel they are different enough that they shouldn't be merged into this category, nor are they a large enough group to justify the creation of a model at this point. And finally, the enterprise group consists of 2-year and 4-year institutions with more than 7,500 fully and partly online students. And really, this is a low number for them. Many of them would average 20 to 25,000 online students, and some are well over 50,000 online students. And we have several of those in our sample. And we often use median figures rather than averages to prevent the distortions that might arise from simply counting the numbers over such a wide span. And we're going to share now a few slides that show one or another aspect of the comparison among these groups to show what they indicate to us and really raise a secondary level of questions, which would be to try to explain and provide the motivation and other forces that may account for these differences. So in terms of the number of fully online students as opposed to students who are partly online or who blend or mix their program, taking some online courses and some face-to-face courses, you can see that at community colleges and low enrollment institutions, in fact, all levels except the regional privates, there are significantly more partly online students or blended students, if you will, than there are fully online students. And this conditions the types of programs they can offer and where student demand is within the institution. On the other hand, there is one area, one of our models in which fully online students predominate, and that is the regional four-year private institutions. And we'll see several follow-up slides that will create a different picture of these regional privates and possibly lead us to some explanation of the difference. But the major takeaway from this slide is that across the board, and even more particularly in some of our models, the dominant trend is toward blending online and face-to-face courses to complete a program. If we ask about the proportions of online undergraduates versus graduates, a very similar picture emerges. Of course, community colleges wholly undergraduate, in fact, almost entirely lower division. But again, low enrollment institutions, regional publics, and even the enterprise institutions show a very high proportion of undergraduate to graduate enrollment online. The online numbers may be more significant if one looks at combining fully online with graduate. But the graduate enrollment is significantly more important at the regional four-year privates. So just keep in mind, those are institutions that have more fully online students than partly online students. They're more graduate than undergraduate. And one might hypothesize here that the graduate programs tend to be, online graduate programs tend to be fully online programs, and that's the consistency that one sees in the regional private institutions. In terms of planned new programs, we see some differences among the models, with the enterprise institutions having the plans to increase their fully online programs and their blended programs more than other sectors. But you can see several other important things from this graphic. For example, the dominance of fully online programs as a developmental priority across all the sectors. This is very significant and somewhat at odds with the fact, as we've seen in an earlier slide, that most students are interested in mixing or blending their programs between online and face-to-face. So the institutional plans seem to be at odds with that. But you might say that these differences don't appear very great, where even the enterprise institutions show fewer than 3 new fully online programs over the next few years. But as the comment in the title suggests, this is a very low estimate. In the CLOE survey, we did not ask for the exact number or an estimated number. We asked for a range. And the 3 ranges we provided were fairly broad. So 1 to 4 programs, 5 to 9 programs, and 10 and more, 10 and above. And the only way we were able to turn this into a chart at all was to make an assumption within those ranges. And the conservative assumption made here is the lowest number in the range for each group. And especially since the 10 and above did not have any cap, it was felt that we would not be justified in trying to pick the average or the middle of each range. There was no middle for 10 and above. So I think the trend here and the areas that are producing more new programs will be valid, but the discrepancy, the distance between the least and the most would probably be significantly greater. Here's a chart that really does indicate significant differences among the models. We asked for the last several years what the greatest source of online competition is by model. And what you see here, perhaps not surprisingly, but certainly validating the model approach, is that community colleges identify local competition as the most significant for them. Remember, they recruit in their local catchment area, and other institutions nearby are logically seen as their primary competitors. If you go to the regional public institutions, lo and behold, it's regional competition that outweighs everything else. And if you look at the enterprise, which are mostly institutions that try to be unbound from their local areas and recruit nationally, it's national competition that dominates. But we want to look at the two other groups, and we see some interesting elements there. One of them is that the regional privates, remember, with more fully online students, with more graduate students, they also see their primary competition as national rather than local. And of course, we asked each institution to cite one of the three. And so this is telling us that 50% identified national competition as their most serious concern. The other one that needs a little further explanation is the low enrollment institutions. And they tend to be scattered across the country, to be very different in their approaches. Some of them perhaps still considering online learning as a supplement or a marginal activity for them. And so they're quite evenly divided in identifying what the most serious competition is for each particular institution. In terms of emphasis on online courses or on building full online programs, we asked this also. And again, there are characteristics of different types of institutions that help to explain the responses we got. Starting with community colleges, they're telling us in a statistically significant way that they are more focused on building online courses than on building online programs. They actually have fewer online courses. They average about 12 fully online programs per institution. And most of their activity online is in building courses that students need and students demand. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, the enterprise level institutions are focused on building fully online programs. This is what is most scalable for them, and they are not creating or investing significantly in building interesting courses that might fall outside the scope of their program structure. So a more regulated and focused activity. Some of the other things that are of interest to us here, look at the regional privates again, and their focus on fully online fully online programs is almost as great as that of the enterprise level institutions. Are these institutions positioning themselves to move to the next level, the enterprise level? That's certainly a possibility. Remember again, their focus or their success has been more with graduate than undergraduate students. That may be a factor here as well. And you can probably think of some other factors that might lead to this. The two groups that seem to fall in the middle are the regional publics and the low enrollment institutions. The low enrollment institutions, I would say, are really just presenting the diversity here of a group that we may further subdivide when we have more data and more participation in the survey. There are clearly those that are emphasizing building courses without an overall program structure, and almost equal number, 31%, that are building programs. But the regional publics, one might be surprised that their focus is not as strongly on online programs. This may reflect a weaker central direction at institutions of this type, more diversity within them, perhaps more distributed control of program and course development. But certainly these are hypothetical explanations that need to be tested in more detail as we go forward, and hopefully with ever bigger samples. Who requires instructional design support for faculty? Here we see that the requirement is strongest in the enterprise institutions. They have the resources to do it. That's the 42% here, and drops as low as 23% at community colleges. And given the data that Richard presented on student engagement in courses that are designed by faculty without instructional design support, it's not surprising that there are challenges at the community college. Other questions in the survey would indicate that it's a resource limitation rather than a philosophical disagreement with the use of instructional design support. I think I'm going to skip some further ones here. These are all covered in the report itself. I urge you to read that. And there will be follow-up studies and, in fact, an infographic on the models, which should be out in the next week or two and available for free download and even in print version, so that you can explore this issue further. And it comes with the challenge to try to find where your institution currently fits best and what you might like to consider in the way of further development. So I'm going to skip from here in the interest of time and move to the final topic and leave some time for questions. We wanted to share with you some of the new and revived areas of the survey that we will be working on in CLOE 4. And again, to urge you to participate in that survey or encourage the chief online officer at your institution to participate. The more participation, the more we can refine the models and explore other areas. But each year we try to focus on some new issues and to respond to the interests of those who fill out the survey. So this time we will be looking in more detail at the pros and cons of centralized versus distributed control of the various support functions for students and faculty. So rather than a general description of how those services are handled, we're going to be looking service by service at which are considered critical to online success, which are centralized, which are distributed throughout the institution. We're going to be looking at the relationship between the chief online officer and other senior administrators, most of whom would have longevity compared to the Chief Online Officer, a relatively recent position at most institutions. But what is that relationship with the Chief Information Officer, with the Chief Academic Officer, with the leaders for other support units at the institution? Preparing faculty to teach online. Is it required? How much of it is required? And a variety of questions related to what it actually consists of. What do institutions think faculty need to be exposed to before they are authorized to teach fully online courses? We're going to be looking at academic honesty issues, the proctoring issues that are so much in the press, and student authentication processes. We're going to be looking at accessibility compliance. How far have institutions come? And we greatly appreciate the frankness with which our respondents assess issues in their responses. We are also going to revisit some important issues. The online program manager industry is in the process of major change and revision. So we're going to update our findings on the use of OPMs, and we'll be holding conference sessions related to that as well. And finally, we're going to revisit the basic finances of online learning, which we explored in the first two CLOE surveys, but after a hiatus of 2 years, we will return to that topic and see whether there are any significant changes there. So with that, I'll turn the program back to Barbara and see if we have any questions that we can answer.
Okay, yeah, the first couple of questions that came in were regarding how online courses are built. So that I'm going to group those questions. One of those questions is if the team approach was voluntary. And let's see, somebody else had a question about whether IDs were required or not, and who comprises another staff group in the development of online courses. Is it TAs, instructional designers?
Let me try and answer those. So to start at the end, we gave some examples of what other staff might include, such as coaches, mentors, helping students stay on track, advisors, if there's a specialist role of that kind. So we didn't limit it. We gave examples. So I think it could certainly be any of those. It could be a TA type role.
If I can add, I would just say that we do think that there is a significant growth in the use of support staff in connection with competency-based programs, and even outside of competency-based programs, recognizing the needs for attention and encouragement that many online students have. And so the role of coaches and mentors is increasing at some institutions. It showed up to some extent in the CLOE 3 survey, but it hasn't spread significantly in the industry as yet, but we would expect to see this grow in the next few years.
All right. One person asked if the online courses were only asynchronous online.
We spent questions on this during the early CLOE surveys, and even some of the questions in CLOE 3 gave an opportunity to validate what we had found. And what we're finding is an overwhelming concentration of effort on asynchronous. Just a small number of institutions. If you remember that detailed chart that Richard showed, at the extreme right-hand side, you see several institutions that are emphasize faculty interaction at a very high level, 50 to 80%, I believe. And in those, we are hypothesizing that they may be a more synchronous type of program. But what we have found, the bottom line is that most institutions find that the advantages of online learning are most felt in an asynchronous model, where students and faculty are freed from time and location constraints. And that the synchronous model greatly reduces the attractiveness to students and their ability and willingness to participate.
But just a caveat on that, we found the most common response to is your online offerings synchronous versus asynchronous to be mostly asynchronous. I think institutions find that some element of synchronicity, some dimension of a class, or one class out of a number can create some variety, can build cohesion and camaraderie within a course. So I think it's some institutions wholly synchronous is the model, but I think others, what's becoming more and more common is mostly asynchronous with a dose of synchronous.
Okay, going back to figure 11, which is on the online student experience possibilities, this person asked, with those universities and colleges stating 100% of the materials is the student experience, wouldn't that be classified as a correspondence course?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Those rules between correspondence and distance are very much in play right now, and whether that old line is meaningful from a federal aid point of view or perceived quality point of view, we don't know enough about that institution's response to know, did they literally mean that, or were they perhaps exaggerating one thing or defining it in a certain way. So yes, I think it's exceptional, as you can see on the slide. It's definitely not the norm. Institutions are very well aware that they need to show that regular and substantive faculty-student interaction to have something judged being worthy of federal student aid. So it may be an outlier, it may be a misunderstanding, it may be a course or a program that isn't eligible for aid, but is nonetheless valued for whatever reason. So, but it's an interesting point, and it's definitely a live issue that I think will evolve as the next round of federal reauthorization happens.
I do think that we need to, and in fact will be, further defining the 4 interaction categories with faculty, with peer students, with materials, with other staff. We'll be providing more extensive definitions, because some of the areas we're not sure that the respondents really were interpreting them in the same way. For example, where does threaded discussions that involve the faculty and students interacting with each other, which category should it belong in, and did everyone answer the question the same way? And then in terms of materials, what constitutes a material as opposed, let's say, to a graded assignment that you get feedback on from the faculty member or another staff member? So we're trying to refine those definitions, rerun some of those questions, and see if our conclusions hold up.
All right. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I think what we need to do is I will capture the rest of everyone's questions, and we can provide answers to those in writing a week from today when we send out the recording, just to be mindful of everybody's time here. So I do want to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar, and I want to mention that we are going to have another QM research webinar. Just visit the research portion of the QM website, and that's going to be on May 15th about a collaboration between QM and the National Survey of Student Engagement. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we really appreciate it. Thank you, Rico. I captured all of the questions, so you can stop the recording or you can end the meeting. Thank you.